Hey everyone, we're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Today's guest is the one and only Tom Rogan. Tom is a commentary writer at the Washington Examiner. He's also the host of the McLaughlin Group. Tom, what's your Twitter handle, by the way? Tom R. Tweets?
It is, yeah.
All right, well, you can follow him on Twitter at Tom R. Tweets. Tom Rogan, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Now, Tom is here today to talk about what the Biden foreign policy looks like. Tom has been on the show in the past to talk about UFOs, but today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk. There he is. We're going to talk to Tom about the Biden foreign policy, what he expects to see from a Biden administration, what he thinks he's seen already from the transition, and what we can kind of glean from the transition process, and what we can say from the transition process might inform the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy, and how it will mark a departure from the Trump era, which in and of itself marked a departure from American foreign policy, the tradition of American foreign policy for decades. So Tom, starting off right now, can you tell us what you expect to see from the Biden foreign policy, maybe just sort of like the top line readout that you have so far from what you've seen and what you expect to see?
Well, I think there will be a more conciliatory approach towards China. That would be, I think, the big takeaway in terms of what the foreign policy team has been saying. How we could look at Joe Biden's record on China traditionally, and quite frankly, how the Chinese will respond to the Biden administration. So that would be the top line. I would expect an effort to return to the Iran nuclear deal, but there are complications with that. The Paris Climate Accord, I think, would be the easiest and quickest thing that Joe Biden will endeavor to rejoin. But the broad thesis, if you will, I think his foreign policy agenda would be recentering the United States alongside its European allies in terms of trying to build up, more openly friendly links, and then more conciliatory on China. So beyond that, it's sort of we shall wait and see.
Well, can we dive into the Iran nuclear deal that you mentioned? What do you think is going to happen right off the bat? Do you think Biden takes office and he immediately tries to restore perhaps the Obama era approach to the Iran nuclear deal and to undo what the Trump administration did? Do you think that's something he'll approach later in his administration? What do you expect to see day one on the Biden administration in terms of the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, I think the Biden administration impetus would be to rejoin as quickly as they can. But the challenge for them will be, because of Iran's development in terms of ballistic missiles and in terms of its now breaches in various areas of the accord, especially in enrichment of uranium above levels and at scales they are absolutely not supposed to be doing. And they themselves have admitted they're doing that. It becomes complicated for him simply to jump America back in, because it poses not simply weakening the credibility of the of the deal itself in terms of stopping a nuclear Iran, which is the whole point, that it would do so by giving Iran a lot of sanctions relief in a way that didn't use the Trump administration earned leverage on Iran. You could get a lot out of Iran now because their economy is, essentially, it's not in the toilet, it's flushed down, it's in the sewers. So there's a leverage lost point there that they will find difficult to excuse to the French and British in particular, who were behind the scenes concerned about the ballistic missile stuff. And thirdly, because of what the Saudis have been doing in terms of their own nuclear proliferation as a response to Iran, and as what they see as a hedge against the Iran deal not working. If Biden doesn't play it carefully, I think you would quickly see the prospect of a nuclear arms race between the Saudis and the Iranians. And they both hate each other, and they're both not particularly known for their political stability. And they have these deep theological hatreds that don't necessarily predispose them to being good, safe stewards of nuclear weapons. So it's a complicated gambit for him. And I think we're going to watch very carefully to see how the best way he could handle that is to try and simply do kind of a variation of what President Trump has been saying all along, which is, we just want a better deal. You allow for better inspections. You stop doing the ballistic missile stuff. You do a couple of other things that are more technical. We can give you some sanctions relief. But if he just says, hey, let's go back to 2015, you can keep doing what you're doing, I think it would rightly be a cause for alarm.
Which side do you think has been vindicated over the course of the Trump administration? Because it has sort of been like a test in the wisdom of the Iran nuclear deal, because Donald Trump kind of came in and went the conservative route, in the same way that conservatives, when the Iran nuclear deal was forged, they were saying they wanted, X, Y, and Z to happen. And Donald Trump came into the office and, pretty much did what conservatives wanted to see in terms of negotiating with Iran. So which side do you think has been vindicated over the course of the administration? And how do you think that will impact Biden's decision making? Because obviously I'm coming at this from a perspective where I would say conservatives and Donald Trump have been vindicated in terms of the Iran nuclear deal. Obviously, the sort of Obama people that Biden is likely to associate with will completely refute that, and they think that their own approach has been vindicated by the course of Iran and our relationship with Iran over over Trump's tenure. But at the same time, there are obviously failures. As you said, there are obviously failures. So how do you think Biden interprets that going into a potential negotiation under his presidency?
Well, I hope he interprets it in the way I laid out. But I think, in the basis of evidence, it's very hard to make the case, I would suggest, that, the Trump administration's Iran strategy was flawed compared to President Obama's. One of the things, interestingly, that doesn't get talked about nearly enough when we hear about the Biden narrative of rebuilding alliances and things like that, the situation of American friends, not simply in the Sunni Arab kingdoms, which is sort of a given, but places like Lebanon. Iraq is the best example, with a prime minister now who really has only been able to be the kind of first nationalist Iraqi prime minister and not an Iranian puppet, because the United States has gutted the Revolutionary Guard Corps' ability to bribe, cajole, threaten these governments. Those allies have benefited manifestly from the sanctions pressure that has been put on Iran. And the proof, actually, and I think they will retaliate it at some point. They will try a big retaliation, probably under Biden, because they think they can get away with it. But actually, the proof of the pressure, of maximum pressure approach working, is that the Iranians, have not responded to the killing of Qasem Soleimani with a high-level assassination effort, which is what we were saying. And I suspect strongly that the reason for that is they fear that the consequences would be so severe under President Trump. It's better to wait for the guy who was in the administration who did nothing when they tried to blow up a DC restaurant.
I want to talk about that actually for a little bit, because in terms of the broader lessons about foreign relations in general that we can take from the Trump administration, Soleimani is such a good example, because as soon as the news broke of his killing, the sort of foreign policy establishment, which is made up of people on both the left and the right, freaked out and said, surely there would be devastating consequences to the United States in response to his killing. We did not see that. Can we talk a little bit, and can you share a little bit about your perspective on how some of this conventional wisdom of the foreign policy establishment has actually been challenged by Trump kind of just totally doing the opposite of what the foreign policy establishment for years has said was right and necessary? And perhaps if you think some of those consequences, this is kind of a leading question, Tom is a trained lawyer, but if you think some of those consequences were, never actually likely to come to fruition?
Well, look, and with Soleimani, when they killed him, I didn't believe it. And I thought, that guy had a rendezvous with death for what he had done, especially with American soldiers, explosively formed penetrators in Iraq, kidnapping and execution of handcuffed Americans. You could go on and on. So he deserved to die. But I thought there would be a much broader Iranian retaliation. My question at the time is, what went behind, what was the intelligence driving that? And, you know, in hindsight, the intelligence was, well, the Iranians really are vulnerable and they don't know how to read Trump. And that, I think, is the critical element here of how Trump has shaken things up, you know, negatively in some ways, but positively in many ways in terms of foreign counterpart dealings. I don't think you would have seen the kind of North Korean shift to negotiations from Kim Jong-un if they truly didn't believe that President Trump was willing to bomb them. You know, the Iranians certainly believing that Trump is capable of anything. The Chinese, which is why you see them really being forced to tolerate a much more robust American military posture, and especially in the South China Sea. The Russians, to a degree, even. This unpredictability. And I think one of the things that has been, I would say, welcome on the Iran side is that, you know, if you read about President Trump's Iran policy, you know, the left will say warmongering crazy, you know, it's going to get us into another, you know, Middle East war. And the right would say, in some areas at least, you know, on the kind of, you know, foreign policies perhaps perspective that I'm closer to, you know, Trump is letting the Iranians get away with too much. And I actually think he's toed a really clever line there, in the sense of when they shot down, you know, John Bolton spends pages in his book complaining about how President Trump didn't military retaliate when they shot that drone down. And, you know, he was right not to do that, because that threw them off balance. And it also avoided, you know, an escalation curve. But when they have done other stupid stuff, there has been, I mean, we've seen this Al-Qaeda leader, you know, shot to death on their soil, and a lot of things like that. So the shaking up of, you know, conventional wisdom and the willingness to sort of take action quickly, I think, is also positive. You know, that's you know, we don't. The French, for example, were furious when President Obama cancelled the strikes against Assad after the Red Line debacle in August 2013, because they had jets on the runway ready to go. And things like that, where allies know that something will get done and get done quickly, or that when Trump says, I'm going to do something, you know, right now, you better take him seriously. Because even if he doesn't do it in the end, you don't know what he's going to do. That unpredictability is a virtue in terms of dealing with adversaries who have an expectation of American hesitation. And yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't think any president in past or future will have the element of unpredictability in the same way that Donald Trump did. But is it your belief that Joe Biden brings a sense of predictability, a sense of sort of listening to America's foreign policy establishment, that makes his potential moves much more predictable? And is that a net benefit or a net loss to the United States going forward?
The net benefit is in terms of, I would say, you know, basic alliance structures, the Japanese, the South Koreans, you know, NATO, for all the flaws that organization has, because there is a sense that, you know, if the worst happened, the United States would be there with them. I would say that's a net positive. The net negative is obviously with people like Kim Jong-un and the Iranians, and most certainly the Chinese, that they feel they can push the line. Because the establishment foreign policy consensus on those issues is to avoid situations that could be destabilizing, that would throw things into the flux. That the kind of, not the hypocrisy, but the irony of that is that I think where you are seen to be kind of, you know, seeking so much stability, your adversaries try and take advantage of that by undermining, you know, by testing the boundaries in ways that very rapidly create instability. And you know, President Obama's approach towards ISIS in the early years is a good example of that, as is the Iranians sustainably pushing the line, and John Kerry giving more and more, in which I don't think actually was his fault. I think it was President Obama saying, we want this legacy deal. I mean, not that Kerry was a great negotiator, but you know, it's so there are positives and negatives. My concern is with where we are with the North Koreans, the Chinese, and the Iranians in particular. A sense of predictability, and Biden not wanting to rock the boat as a problem. I think a big question will be who he brings into his administration, because that will give us a sense of how much this is Obama 2.0 or a sort of perhaps more realist Biden.
So I have two questions based on that last point precisely, which the first is, are there key differences between Biden and Obama that we already know that we should understand? Biden's a longtime member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He touts himself as, he had foreign policy as somewhat of a big part of his platform, talking about a return to normalcy in terms of our foreign policy. And on top of that, well, here, let's just do this. Why don't you answer that question first? Are there key differences between Biden and Obama that we should be aware of going into the Biden presidency?
President, Joe Biden under the Obama administration was far more skeptical about the idea of a long-term presence in Afghanistan. So that, for example, might be something that some conservatives would welcome. I think more concerning would be his hesitation to use. He was against the bin Laden raid. In considering how lethargic the Obama administration was in authorizing things like rescue missions against ISIS hostages, and not because they didn't care, but because they cautioned, they overburdened themselves with a sense of caution. I would say that you might have an expectation that Biden would be respond too cautiously to challenges. What if the Chinese fire warning shots at an American plane flying over international waters in the South China Sea, and the pilot, the chain of command there is, hesitant. Things like that if we'll quickly, I think, see, as you always do with the president, a test on one of those points. But hesitation would be, I think, a watchword. And kind of, I would say an unwillingness to think unconventionally. And that's a problem in terms of, it's not, you see some of the rhetoric that Biden says about, NATO and the French and Germans will just be, c'est très bien, that it's like, we don't have to increase our defense spending to 2%. They'll say, oh, we're going to work for it. But if he just takes off the pressure there, I guarantee you they'll play games again. And that weakens NATO, and it pisses off American taxpayers, because it's why clearly there is a more manifest security benefit to the Europeans from NATO, although I would say the economic benefit accrues, to the American system order. But if he is sort of predictable in those ways, the things even that he says he wants to achieve, strengthening alliances, will over time deplete, and they will play right back into a future Trump-style a narrative. So predictability, I think, would be the key concern.
Well, and my next question, based on your point, was, what early signs do we have of how Biden is going to staff his administration in terms of foreign policy? Has he made any key hires? Has he pushed in any particular direction, or has it sort of been too slow to figure that out yet?
Yeah, just to correct myself, more than predictability, hesitation, and a lack of unconventional thinking. Anyway, so we have the names brought out there, but what's interesting is that we don't have appointments. I mean, I found it has been quite interesting to see the jockeying, which, if it would never have happened under Trump. James Stavridis, who is a former NATO, 4-star US Navy admiral, has been writing these pieces that are just obviously, give me a job, how great the Obama team is. And, so we're seeing that. And, so I think Biden hasn't made up his mind on these things yet. But there are some good younger people out on the Democratic foreign policy side who I think understand these issues more than the kind of old hands who do, as much as they won't admit it, get seduced by the idea of being, fawned over by the French, and that will be a question. I mean, the defense and Secretary of State obviously is the two, keystone foreign policy roles. Will be interesting when we see an announcement there. I mean, if Susan Rice is the Secretary of State designate, which, there was talk, I mean, there is talk of that. The question is whether a Republican Senate would confirm her. I think it's quite obvious. I mean, China will be very excited because she is known as, let's just keep things stable, and the Chinese will just use that to ramp up the cyber espionage and just, think long term, and it'll just take the pressure off. If we saw, for example, though, Michelle Flournoy going to the Pentagon, who I know a lot of people rightly have concerns over because she was very much in favor of the 2011 Libya debacle. But she's very good on China. And so these are, she's tough on the Chinese. She says, we want to shake up, we need to shake up procurement, in terms of some of the choices of how you, and it's really, if you look at what she's written in this last couple of years, it's very minded towards being able to defeat China in a conflict. And to me, that's a good thing. If she's in there, the Chinese will be upset. So we'll see. We just haven't seen much yet. I mean, if Ben Rhodes goes back in, we should just, anyway.
Well, I think even the fact that Susan Rice is being talked about in this capacity is a signal that they wouldn't be opposed to Ben Rhodes coming back in, right?
Right. I think that's exactly right. And if the English literature man returns to the Blob and how brilliant he is, I mean, look, if it goes back to that stuff, it's just going to be an absolute disaster. But
it does seem like the signs are indicating that it is going to go back to that stuff. And if Ben Rhodes is brought back, at least we will get another compelling New Yorker profile.
Yeah, right. Even when you lose the New York Times and you're Ben Rhodes, you have a problem there. But I guess we haven't had the sort of major policy announcements, but when we do, I think it will be an early gauge of where they are going, or whether they really are willing to sort of address some of these obvious issues more resolutely than the Obama administration did.
Right. And I want to talk about China. I think that's, I think we're probably both in agreement that that's the most important this is the most important element of foreign policy right now to think about. And there are legitimate concerns, and how Biden deals with China is bigger than any of his family's financial entanglements with China. But I want to ask you how legitimate you think concerns are that Biden himself was aware of Hunter Biden's, and anybody on the left right now who's listening to this is groaning, but Hunter Biden, there's so much talk of him in Ukraine. His dealings in China, I think, are much more significant and much more damning to an extent because there's sort of direct links to the CCP in some of the allegations and in some of his actual financial dealings, documented financial dealings in China. How do you think this stuff actually really does legitimately impact, and you're the best person to ask about this, you know about all of this, but this stuff does really legitimately impact the conversations between heads of state. How do you think any of that plays into a Biden administration, and how do you think the Obama Biden administration's posture towards China will play as Trump has spent the last 4 years heavily renegotiating that relationship, and clearly with good reason?
Well, I guarantee you, based on how the Chinese work, that if there was anything they had that made Joe Biden look like that he had given favors, I mean, the very fact that he brought Hunter Biden on those official trips,
yes,
is damning in and of itself. And the fact that we don't hear more about that is, I would say, a crystallizing proof of media bias in foreign policy, because it's not even complicated that the Chinese, as do the Russians, will use anything they can use to extract political favor, especially against a democratic system where pay to play would be viewed very poorly if it came out. And we do have, indications that the very fact he went on that trip, it wasn't that he was going on that trip to, walk around on the Great Wall. He was on that trip to, do business dealings. And he was there with the vice president, and he was rewarded for that. And so the Chinese, I think, will certainly, in the private meetings between Xi and Biden, if there's anything there that kind of looks off, they'll try and dangle that, say, hey, at the very least, do you want a embarrassing news story right at the beginning of your term? But more, I think they will try and use this sort of, we've been friends before, Trump was crazy, we've learned some lessons, what I would say BS narrative, which they're very good at, to try and get the US to relinquish pressure. The two core concerns, though, you already see this with Xi Jinping's September UN General Assembly speech, where he promises 2060 carbon neutral, and the left are like having an orgasm over it. And even, but it's annoying though, because in the last 2 years, they've constructed hundreds of new, incredibly dirty coal plants. And they promised President Obama in 2015 that they would try and cap by 2030, or dramatically reduce. I can't remember which. Anyway, so the record with what she says and the Communist Party say is totally incongruent with reality. Basically, a good rule is whatever they say, believe the opposite. But if Biden sort of plays into, and they'll give him some early trade wins, I think, and they'll sort of behave for the first 6 months. But what they will very quickly do after, which they pledged to do, and without saying explicitly, is to massively ramp up cyber espionage and intellectual property theft, because Xi's great new 5-year plan is to have an independent Chinese technology base. The only way they can do that, especially because of some of the sanctions of the Trump administration, but regardless of them as well, is to steal the very highest level American IP and that of the Europeans. And when they start doing that, what will Biden do? If he does what Obama did, it will be nothing.
So I want to ask what the Susan Rices, the Joe Bidens, and the Ben Rhodes of the world don't get about China. Is the Biden administration an administration that would be holding China's feet to the fire if the coronavirus outbreak had happened under his watch? Or is it one in which the cost-benefit analysis of attacking China would influence them to play down China's role in downplaying the early information that we needed to know about the outbreak? What do they not get about China, and how will their rhetoric towards China sound? I would ask in comparison to Trump, but we already know that.
I think the fundamental problem is that they don't see China for what it is, which is a new Soviet Union, but much more prospectively powerful, because its ability to leverage political fealty with economic investments in a way that the Soviet Union never could.
But why don't they understand that?
Well,
I mean,
because
that seems plain as day.
They believe that the American-led international order, the Europeans, Australia, Japan, these great democracies, they will say India is now, ultimately at the crunch point will have the power to restrain the worst edges of that Chinese power. And if you don't play that longer game in terms of working that diplomatic angle, you could end up with a war with the Chinese that would be devastating to the global economy. I think that they put too much trust in the power of those alliances. And I think the Trump administration has proved this. I mean, look at how hard it has been, even with Britain, to get Britain to stop Huawei. In Britain's own domestic, signal intelligence service said Huawei is deliberately designed with flaws so the Chinese intelligence service can get backdoor access. And then Huawei says, "Oh, sorry, it was a flaw. We didn't know about it." That's been open, and that was open 2 years ago. And so, if the British are struggling to push back against that Chinese economic pressure for political fealty thing, I think in the way that the Obama people thought they could sort of at some point have this snapback alliance structure. How on earth, other developing, basically, I think that the key takeaway, which the Trump people got quickly, is that China has an idea to really replace the American-led order in all those things. That is what would happen if you don't very aggressively and robustly challenge them and push allies very quickly to challenge them. And I think the Obama people, quite frankly, just didn't have the stomach for it. And I also think because some of the establishment economic interests, which I've been really disappointed to see, someone who, as you know, Emily, our sort of conservative friends would tease me as being kind of perhaps more corporatist minded, conservative. It's been astonishing to me the degree to which major banking institutions, as you've so eloquently written about, some of our cultural institutions, the NBA in particular, Hollywood, have been so willing to kowtow to the Chinese. And unfortunately, I think you see Tim Geithner, right, Obama's Treasury Secretary, was just in Shanghai doing a suck-up talk where there's a lot of money there, and those political those establishment people want smooth waters, and they don't really. I think honestly, I would go so far as to say patriotism is not very high on their priority list. As long
I
as
think that's well said. I mean, because I think when we look across the industries, that's what it always comes down to, is there's so much money to be made from China. And it's easier when there is all of that money to be made from China to rationalize a more lukewarm policy towards the country, because your donors want that.
I think, and I would say just sorry to interrupt, and then I'll shut up. One really good thing, which will last with the Trump administration, as ironic as it sounds with some of what the president says about the FBI, is that the domestic counterintelligence apparatus to sort of detect, a lot of the prosecutions have been Chinese intelligence officers or agents. I think in the coming years, because of that, FBI resourcing on the Chinese, a lot of it is going to be some pretty high up executives, Americans, who essentially have given the either pay to play or transfer of IP, and so that stuff really is going to make it much more difficult, for example, for companies like Google to do what they did and say, oh, well, we're not going to work with the Pentagon because all our woke employees will freak out about that, but we will help the Chinese use Dragonfly and censor their own people because, hey, throwing 2 million Muslims into concentration camps and sterilizing them is awesome.
Right. As kind of a tangible example, do you think if Joe Biden were president in February and March, his rhetoric towards China would have been aggressive? Do you think he would have held their feet to the fire for their negligence and willful negligence in the spread of coronavirus? Or do you think it's something that, like the World Health Organization and some other folks in the foreign policy community, would have sought to publicly downplay?
Yeah, World Health Organization, a wonderful leader there. Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see what comes about where some of his finances have come from, I think, in the coming years. Anyway, with Biden, no, I think clearly, we saw this, right? That we saw when Trump introduced the travel ban, and yes, Trump did early on say she had it very much under control. It was great, wasn't going to be a problem. But when he brought in the travel ban, Biden immediately this is xenophobic. This is, basically CPC talking points. And what's concerning about that is that, Biden, having received the highest level intelligence briefings for at least the 8 years of his vice presidency, but also certainly having people who are telling him stuff from the intelligence community, they must have known at that point that the Chinese were being highly deceptive, and still the recourse was to play to that idea, Trump bad, so anything just to take the opposite approach. And no, I think there would have been much more hesitancy. I mean, you see now, even with the degree to which the Chinese, whether it's selling inferior personal protective equipment repeatedly, hoarding that stuff, covering up at least some of the data around the early outbreak in Wuhan. There's no, even if you say the Trump's China plague narrative, which I would say is probably too far, there's no, it's sort of Chinese that buys into, again, the Communist Party line, which is we're all in this together. And we're clearly not, based on their conduct.
Why is Trump's China plague narrative too far?
Well, because I think, playing to the plague, where, actually come from, European upbringing, at least in America, growing abroad in Europe. Otherwise, I'm going to get the Federalist haters on me, even more than I normally do. The plague, the Black Death, killed millions of, wiped out sort of 30% at least of Europe's population. So I think that it's slightly less lethal. I would also say, if we're going to adopt that approach, then the Spanish flu could have been called the America plague by some understandings of where it came from. And I think what he should have called, here's a better word, right? Here's a better description, is say the CPC enabled coronavirus. And that way it's kind of technical, it sounds kind of boring and scientific, but that's what happened. That's, factually, they enabled it because they didn't want to address it. And it speaks to the ultimate point here, which is this is a regime which absolutely cannot be trusted unless you have a self-harm fetish. That is the only reason to trust the Chinese government if you want to hurt yourself.
Where do we stand with North Korea? And has Trump put us in a better position right now in 2020 than he was left in 2016? And how could that change under Joe Biden?
I think we are in a better position. I think President Trump has put too much trust in the personal relationship with Kim Jong-un. But look, we haven't had to take military action yet, which is a positive in and of itself.
And did seem imminent as Obama.
And was imminent. And there were a lot of, and it really was imminent because there were a lot of very boutique things that we don't have, assets that we don't have a lot of, that we really want to save for China or Russia if we went to a major war, that were being moved to South Korea and Japan in anticipation of that. And that stuff is, so we really were very close in those 2017 days to at least massive air campaign against their nuclear program. They haven't tested long-range ballistic missiles since the end of 2017. That's positive. But they have improved both their, the re-entry vehicles. Now they have a missile that can, they fire one missile and various little warhead vehicles come out of it and could drop on American cities. And they are improving their targeting and some of the fueling logistics around it. So, they have continued to develop stuff. And I think quite quickly in President Biden's tenure, they will probably do an ICBM test to see whether he does what kind of President Trump has done, which I would say is a credit point to the president, is that he hasn't been willing to overdo that friendship trust thing, right? That he has said, I would be very upset, and they've said it back channels, this friendship is dead if you do another ICBM test. And if the Biden people say, well, hedge, we're going to try and get some more sanctions, but we won't push the Chinese and Russians, then, we get into dangerous territory. Unfortunately, I kind of feel that the Biden administration, based on how they approached Iran, would be willing to tolerate a North Korean nuclear strike capability. And I just think that would be a really bad idea, but I think that's where their impulse would go, because I don't think they have the ability, as Trump did, to really make the North Koreans question whether they would use military force.
Something that's interesting to me is how there's sort of been an audible sigh of relief among the foreign policy establishment in America that Biden will be returning us to a sense of normalcy with our allies. And that's something you hinted at earlier. But what have we learned over the course of the Trump administration about our relationship with, some of those European countries that are our allies, with NATO, with the UN, with the World Health Organization? Have we learned that those relationships aren't as precious and essential as some people in the foreign policy establishment insist that they are? Or have we learned the opposite, that they are dearly important and that we have lost out, or that there has been a cost to our standing internationally over the course of the Trump administration because of some of the frostiness towards them?
I think both elements are true. I mean, look, the European allies are incredibly important to the United States in the sense of prosperity, a sustaining prosperity that has massively benefited. If you believe in free trade as I do, or rules-based free trade, or you call cheaters out as I do, then you certainly have to say that NATO has been incredibly successful in that regard, providing for capitalism for trade, in preserving the peace, both at a moral and promotion of democracy point of view, American values, also very important. And yet, the lesson of the Trump administration, as Robert Gates predicted when he was under President Obama, is that it required a Trump to snap the Europeans out of the mindset, rationally made, that they could continue for perpetuity having the American taxpayers subsidize their defense. We do have still far too few NATO countries, Britain, the Baltic states, surprise, right next to Russia, that they want to spend 2% on defense. Greece, which wastes too much on manpower instead of equipment, but at least is at 2%. The Germans are still at 1.3 to 1.4%. The French sort of hover around 2%. That's just totally unacceptable. And it should be called out as such, because it undermines the basic premise of any alliance, which is that there should be a baseline of mutual burden sharing. And I say this to someone, yes, the United States, I believe, should provide the manifest capability, but there is no excuse. And that's why I think President Trump was right to remove some of those forces from Germany. There is no excuse for this kind of activity. And I think it's been very healthy to snap the Europeans out of that and to kind of foster other European countries who are saying, the Americans are right, and military to military dialogues. And things like the Germans allowing Nord Stream 2, and President Trump rightly tweets about that, which I think is the best example. The Russians do not have anything terribly significant over him, is that that's a huge priority for them, Nord Stream 2. And Chancellor Merkel, supposedly, we're told by the media, the leader of the free world, loves it. And so kicking the Europeans in the behind, as well as saying Article 5 of NATO is unequivocal, that's the way to go. I just worry that Biden will just sort of give them a pass, and then probably many of viewers of your show will simply say, proved everything that Trump said about this being a waste of time. It degrades the alliance over time. I would say what's really interesting, though, look at the comparison to how the Indians now and the Australians in particular have responded to China. I mean, we talk about alliance building. The Trump administration's success with the Australians and the Indians has been, revolutionary.
Why is that?
Because the Indians have realized what the Chinese government are like. They lie about everything. They say, oh, we just want you to respect our borders, and then they slowly they just start building literally physical structures on Indian soil, and the Indians, and then they say, oh, let's talk about it diplomatically. And then when the Indians push back a bit, they hack them to death and push them off the side of a cliff. And so the Indians are saying, with a government that has, a nationalist prime minister who's very powerful, F this. And to the Trump administration's credit, Pompeo and Esper and Trump are there saying, hey, you want this military stuff, this stuff, nuclear suppliers group, we're not going to have to wait a year to discuss it like the Obama administration did. Here it is. And so you then build a new culture of understanding. China is our enemy, is determined to be our enemy, is providing nuclear support to the Pakistanis, their great Indian nemesis. The Americans are saying, whatever you want, we just kind of want to be closer friends with you. And the American Indian community, right, when Prime Minister Modi goes to Houston with Trump and there's a kind of massive rally there, that sense actually to Indians who perhaps were more skeptical of the United States, that America is a natural ideological partner through shared values and kind of antipathy, quite frankly, towards the Chinese. But that wouldn't have happened if the US hadn't been willing to very quickly ignore all the Chinese BS from the foreign ministry saying, if you do this to the Indians, it's going to be major consequences for you. And simply saying, whatever, we're going to do it. And same with the Australians, right? The Australians at the moment, Xi is doing his masterful speeches about how we're all friends and let's build a new co-prosperity sphere and everyone's going to benefit. And then they've put, trade tariffs. They let the Australian goods, and Trump should have been tougher on the Chinese over that. But basically, I would say, being tough on allies, but also being willing to stand with allies in face of a common threat and not equivocate about the nature of that threat. That's the key. Keep it simple. The nature of the Chinese regime is charted by its deception on coronavirus, to its persecution of its own people in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, to its industrial intellectual property theft, and to it's throwing people in prison, for writing an article calling the leader a clown. And of course, the number one, doing in the South China Sea what the Japanese did in the 1930s, and saying, I would say to your viewers, just go on Google Images and type in nine dash line, and the Chinese claim that that's theirs. It's insane. It's imperialism. It's against everything that the Biden narrative of the liberal world order should stand for. But it's only been under this president that The Germans are finally sending a ship to the Indian Ocean. It's the wrong ocean, but at least they're getting closer. So the Allies are sort of waking up. Anyway, I'll shut up.
No, please, Tom, never shut up. It's your job to not shut up, actually. Tom, by the way, is American. He's both American and British. Fun fact about Tom Rogan. I think this is to some people on the left. Again, this might be groan-inducing, but when we think back to the 3 years that this country spent mired in scoops, allegedly, about Russian collusion, and the fact that we now likely have a president who is about to import the same foreign policy establishment that was insistent on the validity of this narrative for years. Do you think that there's any modicum of humility among this class of people? You are actually Tom is a really good example of this. Tom is somebody who's like straight up said mea culpa on Russian collusion and has, explained why he was personally wrong to sort of chase it in the way that he did. But do you think there's anybody else has any humility? I think literally you might be one of the only people I've seen talk about that at all.
Yeah, no, and I put too much trust in Christopher Steele, who was he was a very good SIS MI6 officer against Russia, but basically made all that stuff up, or had no tradecraft. And I also thought, based on sort of President Trump's character and Moscow trips, that you could see potential for the Russians to take advantage of him, as they would have. I have no doubt they have tried to, but the evidence just hasn't been there. And unfortunately, you have to have your hands up, because if you really care about the country, right, and you're trying to get people to take journalism, whatever, seriously, you have to say, I effed up big time, right, on that. And why should people believe? I mean, this is the point you hit at, right? It's not about us. It's not. If your people are returning to government,
yes,
and this is why it would be catastrophic, I think, for example, that if someone like John Brennan was able to come into government, which I think I hope they would have the awareness of how damaging that would be, that people would lose faith, even more faith in intelligence institutions in particular. And a lot of this is what people don't realize, is a lot of people, CIA, would say, yeah, why can't Brennan shut up? Because unless there's sort of, job is to present evidence. And the people who they were saying, the deep state idea was always really the political appointee level people, the the Obama holdovers, the Obama, they were the ones doing the unmasking requests. It's not the kind of nuts and bolts people out in the film, the analysts who are really just trying to protect the country. And they don't want that politicization on any side. And so I worry that if these people, we saw McCabe, it is so antithetical to the values of most of the people in those organizations, in his case saying, oh, by the way, we're now 4 years in, oh, but there's something extra secret SCI compartmented, which is code word only. But do we really think if that was there, that would not have come out a while ago? This is not serious stuff. It's honestly probably what it is. It's a Russian. They probably had someone close to Putin, making up a story, which the Russians do when they know they're being listened to by the NSA. They assume what their encrypted calls they're being listening to, and they probably made up a story. And it's probably that.
But here's the thing: is the idiots in our foreign policy establishment bought it hook, line, and sinker, and were criticizing, of all people, the Republicans and the Trump administration for furthering or advancing Russia's interest in the United States. When, to your point, if this is something that came and was fabricated by somebody close to Putin, it was them. They were the ones that were doing it, and they're about to retake power over our foreign policy.
Right, well, and here's the challenge as well, is that the nuts and bolts of American policy, and I don't like how the president approached the Ukraine issue. I think that was not in our interest or the Ukrainians. But his policy before that, again, he did have a great line, which is true. That Obama gave them blankets and I've given them anti-tank weapons. What do you think? They want, and what do you think the Russians are more concerned about? And some of the sanctions actions, more than that, the kind of intelligence actions that really, NSA, CIA have been able to, when they make a request to do something against the Russians, been signed off on. That just didn't happen under the Obama administration. And a lot was tolerated that was utterly unacceptable in some ways and would never have been tolerated, during the Cold War. And so, this idea that somehow Trump has been weak on Russia and Biden will return American strength, I think is deeply misguided. Again, let's go back to Nord Stream 2. That was something that it is absurd that is even questioned as something that a NATO country should be pushing. But it is. And, let's see, will Biden, here will be the test. Will Biden be tweeting, perhaps in slightly less caps lock way, I'm deeply concerned about Nord Stream 2 and will be sanctioning companies that fulfill it? I doubt it. And so that's I think is that the closeness of the election, I think has, obviously there's a lot of arrogance, in power, but has reminded some of these people, or hopefully has made them think, really more people than we would see can see through this stuff. I also think on China, one positive thing is that the military and intelligence community have been enabled by Trump to sort of put their war cap on, right? That their mentality now is early Cold War, existential threat, take them on. And if they try and let the Chinese off on some of this stuff, it's going to leak very quickly. And if the New York Times doesn't want to run it, I'll run it. You'll run it. Other people will run it. And there will be great young reporters who will run it because, they think, shit, so that stuff now.
You're not young anymore, Tom.
No, I know. No, I'm putting myself separate.
I know. Tom, before we let you go, I need to get you on the record in 30 seconds or a minute on Trump being the singular figure that he is, why he might be our last chance to learn or to declassify some stuff on UFOs. This is something that Tom is extremely well sourced on and he follows very closely. It might sound silly, but we've had him on the program before to talk about this, and it is actually deeply serious and raises a lot of questions. So, Tom, what's your quick answer on what Donald Trump should and could do when it comes to UFOs in his lame duck tenure?
There's I would say very dramatic piece coming out in the next couple of weeks by a friend of mine on this subject, which will force more media attention. But, look, I think President Trump should be able to declassify certainly some of the historic stuff that doesn't necessarily involve current. So we don't want the Chinese to figure out how good we are at, detecting things, right? So, but historic stuff, something probably did happen at Roswell. We don't know what, and declassify that. That will just upset, the consensus in some ways because they fear about, what will it mean for society at large, and does it, Anyway, I think he can. There are ways to do this. Unfortunately, I think at the moment he's not terribly interested in it. I think he kind of, you'd think it would be right up Trump's alley. That's something kind of unconventional. I'm going to ride that wave, but. That stuff is going to keep coming out now. The dam has been broken because, so regardless of Trump going. But anyway, Roswell, let's tell us what happened in that New Mexico desert.
All right. Well, Tom, we'll have you back on to talk more about that because I think, like you said, there's about to be more media attention on it. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Emily.
This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. He's Tom Rogan. He's a commentary writer at the Washington Examiner, host of the McLaughlin Group, and you can follow him on Twitter at TomRTweets. Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, we will be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.